everyone! This is my tutorial on how to assemble my Supergirl cape pattern, which can be found on my Etsy, which is linked below. So I'm starting off by assembling the pattern. I'm trimming off the excess and just sticking it together with some tape. And this is how they look all printed out and stuck together. These measurements here, just to clarify, that is your height, not the length of the cape. So if you're 5'3", that's the second line. And this is the material that I'm using. It's this very thin, lightweight faux leather that I found on Amazon, also linked below. So I'm starting off just by tracing out the pattern onto my leather, 2 with piece 8, and then I've cut that off to cut out the other 4. This is how it looked, which you can't really see, so I've drawn this diagram to kind of show the placement that I did, and then these are all my pattern pieces cut out. So to start off, I'm going to iron all of my leather on the back, not the front, don't want to melt it. And now I'm doing, at this point, I'm measuring up 1/2 inch and I'm drawing a line from the bottom. And then I'm just going to mark it on the top, like that. I'm doing that on all of those pieces. So now I'm just lining it up with the centre of the larger piece. So this is basically piece A or B with piece D, and I'm just using my ruler to make sure that it's even on either of these sides. And then I'm just putting pins in on these bits here that overlap, and that will make it easier to stitch together. So to start stitching, that line that we drew before is the first thing that I'm stitching down, so I'm literally just stitching over the exact line. And then I'm reversing back, and you need to make this a separate stitch from the main one because we're going to basically cut it off later. So I'm putting my needle back to the mark that I made at the top of that line, so 1/2 inch away from the edge. And then I'm just putting my needle down so I can rotate the fabric around, and I'm removing that pin. And what I'm going to do while the needle is in there, I'm moving the 2 pieces of fabric from piece B and piece D together and holding that in place. And then I'm stitching along at that 1/2 inch seam allowance, just a regular straight stitch. You can also pin that if you want. I just find it easier to kind of move it around as I sew just to make sure it's all lined up still. So to do the other side, I'm putting my needle back in at that mark. So I'm just starting off my stitch and putting the needle back down into it, and then I'm doing the same thing on this side. So I've already removed the pin there, and now I'm just moving it about so that the edges line up, and then I'm going to sew down it. You might have a little bit of like a wrinkle around where the needle is at this point, but that's fine. So I'm just like moving the excess fabric out of the way there. And when you're done with that, you can just take your scissors and cut down the line that we stitched, and that will leave you with this almost finished piece. So now I'm going to top stitch it. I'm using a roller foot here because it's hard to top stitch leather. My stitch settings are on the longest length that my machine does, and I'm just sort of pulling the leather apart like that whilst I sew, which just kind of helps everything to sit flat. and I'm top stitching to the left of my seam, so if you held the cape up it would be nearest to the bottom edge, and that's trapping the seam allowance in there as well. And that's how that looks when it's all done. So you can repeat that for all 6 of those sets of pieces, and now what I'm going to do is, starting with piece A, I'm going to attach it to piece B. And the easiest way to do this is starting with the piece A that's going to be on the left, then do the next B, then the next B after that, and so on until you get to the right A. That way, as you top stitch the seams, you won't have too much fabric on the right side of the needle. So I'm just pinning those pieces together, making sure that the seam lines up where piece D starts. So now I'm just going to stitch that together. I'm using quite a short stitch here. And then once you've done this, you can top stitch it like we did with all the panels. So the way that it's top stitched is this very middle seam is stitched on either side of the seam line, and then on the left side, on the side of the seam nearest to the centre. So you can see that on these. And then the same goes for the other side, so it's opposite here. So from the inside you can see that means this centre seam is basically pressed open, whereas all of the other ones are pointing towards the centre. So for the lining, I've basically I placed my cape on top of this lining fabric, which is just regular cotton, and I traced out the shape and then I cut it, and then what I'm going to do on this edge here is cut off about an inch or so, and I'm just going to iron the lining before I attach it. So this is me having pinned the lining in. I realised I cut the neckline a little bit wide, I guess, so I have like some miniature pleats, but I've attached the lining all around. You can see that it's a bit, it doesn't sit completely flat on this bit because we cut off that inch. So because I cut the lining a bit slimmer than the rest of the cape, when you start attaching it, when you get to the very edge, this bit has to fold over in order to make this line here, and that will create like a turned in seam almost. So now from the centre point coming down, I've moved the clip right at the bottom to these 2 side ones, and then when I stitch around it I'm going to leave this gap here to turn everything through. So when stitching the lining in place, the best thing to do is to start with the 2 side seams of the cape first, and then do the neckline, then the bottom edge. So after doing the neckline, this is the like the front flaps, and I'm just cutting off the seam allowance here so that they'll have like a nicer point to the end when I turn it out. So having sewn in the lining, I haven't closed that gap up yet though, so I've done some temporary pleating just to stick it onto my mannequin, and then I've kind of gone around with these clips just to basically just to secure everything in place in the way that it is like. So like the way that the cape falls, I've just gone down and then clipped it in place, and then it's because I'm going to go and press all of this edge, so it's just sort of easier when you know how it falls. And so I've done that around the edges too because the leather sticks in. And then I'm going to show how to pleat it properly in just a... So I'm going to start pressing the cape now with the iron. I'm using this scrap of poly cotton to put on top of it just to avoid melting the leather really, and I'm just starting off with the front of the cape here. So I'm basically just going to press like the edges around the entire cape to do this, removing the clips as I go. So now that that's done, I'm going to start pleating the fronts of the capes. This is basically just like one pleat where it's like tucked in on either side, and I'm just sort of pinning it in place. There are better instructions on this and the sort of width that it should be in the actual instructions. So I'm using a invisible hand stitch to do this. There are much better videos that'll show you how to do that, and that's how it looks. I should also point out that the bottom inch or so I haven't actually sewn down because I'm leaving space for the snaps to go in. So now what I'm going to do is start pleating the rest of the neckline. So first of all, this is the centre seam, and you're going to keep that at the centre. And then create basically two large pleats in the back, one on either side of that. So again, like folded down like this on either side. And the way I'm doing it is so the next seam along from the centre one will be in the centre of this pleat, if that makes sense. You'll probably be able to see it better in a second. So you can see better here what I mean by that. So the very centre of this, so just to the right of that fold is the actual centre line of the cape, and on the pleat you can see the seam of sort of the next two panels is in the centre there. Again, this is better explained in the instructions. With those clips on there, I'm just like holding the cape up to check the fit. I'm pretty happy with it, so I'm gonna go ahead and stitch that in place. So now for the cape attachment, I'm gonna use this undershirt pattern, which you can find on my Etsy, but it's not a multi-size pattern. You will have to adjust it. So you could also just use like a regular bodice pattern. It just needs to be close fitted so it will stay in place when you're wearing it. and I'm going to attach it with snaps like I said before. But if your cape is really heavy, sometimes the snaps aren't strong enough to hold it, so you can, and there's more detail in this in the instructions, but you can instead add like strips of fabric as straps, which kind of cross across your chest and attach behind your back with Velcro. That's a really good option if your cape is very heavy. I use quite a lightweight leather, so I'm going for this method. And for this I'm going to use this drill cotton. It's pretty sturdy fabric, so it should hopefully be quite strong, so good for supporting the cape. And this is just the pieces cut out, and I'm just going to add the darts and sew those in. So I've just sewn all that together. I've used bias binding on all the edges there. I ran out of the red stuff, as you can see. And one important thing to note about this is that the zip in it is upside down. Because if you do it the normal way, unless you use an open-ended zip, you're not going to be able to get into it, so you can see that here. So now for inserting the snaps. So this is a kit that I've bought off Amazon, and it will be linked below. So I'm going to attach these to the fronts of the cape, and I'm using this tool that came with the set. I did try the hammer-in ones for my last cape, but I just found it really difficult to get them to sit flat, and they just didn't work that well and kept coming undone. So these are good, but they can only get through relatively thin stuff, so if your leather is really thick, you might need to get the hammer-in ones. And these are the ones that I'm putting in first, so I don't know what the actual name for this is, but the snaps that have like the protruding part are going on here, this way up. And you'll see why that is, because on my undergarment I'm gonna have them attached underneath rather than on top of it, and doing that will mean that it's smoother underneath the actual suit, so you shouldn't be able to see any lines or anything. So I've just put those in, and you should put them on the cape first, because I'm gonna like try it on to see where the corresponding snaps will go on the actual undergarment. So now I'm just gonna hold the cape in place on me and just sort of check in the mirror that it looks okay, and then I'm using this crayon to just mark where the snap should go. And I've just attached them and tried it on, and I was happy to find that it only required 2 snaps to hold on. On my mannequin, you can see that because it doesn't fit it gets pulled back like this. So I've just put it into place with pins to kind of better show what this will look like. One is taking these clips, and I've basically like clipped both sides of each pleat together. So you can see this main pleat, they're held like that, and then the side pleat is like that too, all around. And then I'm gonna do that again with like connecting these things, so I'll pin these 2 together as well as like that. So it ends up looking like this. And the reason for doing this is that, I mean, I would always recommend leaving the cape on a mannequin or just a hanger if you don't have a mannequin. To just kind of let gravity let everything drop it out, if that makes sense. Like, I find that the leather sort of ends up falling into place a bit better, and you can kind of force it to fall where you want by leaving it like this overnight. So I'll come back to it tomorrow and see how it's looking. And this is the finished cape. So I haven't finished the rest of the cosplay yet, which is why I'm wearing it with the dark Supergirl costume. But you can get a feel for kind of how nicely this cape moves. Obviously I'm limited for space, so here's some shots of the dark cape I made, which kind of better show the movement it has. But anyway, thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing, I really appreciate it. Thank you.